Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kenny Voss, and I will be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on job special provisions. Our goal with these webinars is to ensure employees receive the technical training necessary to successfully deliver projects into the future. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. We are scheduled for 2 hours today. This includes time for the presentation and time for questions and answers. We are recording today's webinar and will place the recording in Mo.U for future reference. The webinar will be added to the course catalog of the Program Delivery Training Program and to Mo.YouTube channel. All lines are muted during the presentation. The question and answer function will be open, so I encourage you to send questions to all panelists in the chat pod. We will break after the presentation to address questions from the Q&A pod. The presenters will also be taking additional verbal questions at this time. For today's webinar, we will have 3 presenters. I am pleased to introduce to you our first speaker, Danica Stovall-Taylor, who is the Bidding and Contract Services Engineer in the Design Division. At this time, I will hand it over to our opening presenter, Danica. Danica?
Thank you, Kenny. Welcome. We're going to talk about job special provisions today. Before we get into too much detail about job special provisions, we kind of wanted to give you a big picture of the importance and the documents that the contractor has. And so really, we give them a couple tools to build a project. 2 are our standards, our Missouri Standard Specifications for highway construction. We refer to that as our spec book. It's got all of the our specifications, and it's by numbering. We have our numbering system. 100 is a contract language, 200 is excavation, and 400 is our flexible payments, and so on. And then we have our Missouri Standard Plans for highway construction, and those are kind of similar to our specifications by our numbering system. And then we also have this job special or the job specific documents, which is our contract and the contract plans. And inside the contract, we have it's got several little bits and pieces. Sarah, can you go to the next slide, please? The contract has a lot of different little pieces in it. And the first one is our contract language. And the contract language kind of goes over, it has the bid letting information, it has like the DBE goal, it's got the indexes for the contractor to select. The next thing is we have the itemized sheets. That is our our bid items and the unit bid prices and the totals for those. Then the next thing we would have in our contract is the Dbe and Subcontractor Submittals. So anytime we have a contract, the contractor has to submit a DBE if it's a federal contract, and then we have those in the contract, so we hold them to that. We also give them the tax exempt letter and form, and then also we have the job special provisions for roadway and bridge. We have those separated out just for ease for design and bridge to coordinate those and get those into the contract. And then we have our federal aid provisions and wage rates, and then we have our state wage rates. If it's a state contract, it will only have the state wage rates, but if it's a federal contract, it will have both. And then we require the contractor to pay the higher of the 2. We have our general provisions and supplemental specifications. Our general provisions are just general language that is not covered in our spec book. And then we have the supplemental specifications, and those are supplementals that have not been incorporated into the spec book yet. So I think we have those on a quarterly basis that we update the spec book. And so those are in the supplemental specifications. And then we also have the supplemental plans. So anytime we do an update on those quarterly revisions, we include those in the contract. And then we have our contract agreement and our contract bond. So we require all of our contractors to have a contract performance bond, and that is for the whole amount of the contract. So whatever the contract amount is, they have to have a bond for that, and it's accompanied by a power of attorney. And then for the contract agreement, we do require all electronic contracts. And so our contractor executes it. We submit it to our CCO, and then they review it to form and check the bid bond. And then it goes to our executive team. Usually our chief engineer or assistant chief engineer will execute it for the executive team. And then it goes to our chief's counsel's or our commission secretary's office, who executes it for the commission. And so those are all the pieces that the contractor has to build the contract or the project on. Next slide, please. And I just kind of wanted to go over this a little bit for you so that you can, if you have any questions about what the contractor sees when they're putting their bids together, we have this all out here so that the bid book is our contract language. And then we have our job special provisions for roadway and then bridge. And then you have your contract plans and our cross sections and then electronic deliverables. The electronic deliverables are not contractual. It's just information that we provide to the contractor to help them put their bids together. Next, we'll have Sarah Kleinschmidt. She's our policy and innovative engineer, and she'll get into more details on the job special provisions.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So where do you find your job special provisions or the JSPs? There are two places to find or access the Jsp database. The first place is on Design Division's SharePoint site. If you go to Design's SharePoint site, you can select the drop-down menu for Sections, then select Engineering Policy Services. From there, you can select the JSP link or the block that says JSPs. The second way to access the Jsp database is through MoDOT's external website. First, go to modot.org. From there, you can select the Doing Business with MoDOT link, and then scroll down to Standards and Specifications. I like to hover my mouse over the Doing Business with MoDOT link, wait for the menu to show, and then select Standards and Specifications. Then on the left-hand side of the web page, you can select Job Special Provisions from the list. The next window that appears is the Jsp database. The default view is shown on the slide. This is actually the JSP by title view. In this view, you will see 4 types of JSPs listed below the blue box. They are standard, non-standard, Lpa, and Jsp packages. I will go over the 4 types of JSPs in just a couple of minutes. If you expand the first JSP standards by clicking on the little plus sign right there, you will see the first 3 documents listed are not actually JSPs. These are documents that help you with formatting the JSPs, instructions for setting up the JSPs, and a JSP template that already has been started for you. If you haven't already read these documents, I recommend you do so after this webinar, and definitely before starting your next set of JSPs. Start by reading the instructions, then the formatting guide, and then the template. The template has 6 required JSPs for every project. More to come on the 6 required JSPs as well. Now that you know where to find the JSPs, let's talk about what a JSP is. Webster defines a provision as something you do beforehand to prevent problems later down the road. By providing job special provisions in a contract, we should be able to avoid contractual issues down the road. In simple terms, a JSP is another form of specification that is contractually binding, and the contractor has to follow those. So if the JSPs are just specifications, why are they not in the spec book with all the other specifications? That's a good question. The standard specifications apply to all projects, while JSPs apply to only certain projects, certain parts of a project, miscellaneous pay items, a special material, or a special process. Remember the list of 4 JSPs I mentioned earlier, the standard, non-standard, Lpa, and JSP packages? Now I'm going to go over each type of those JSPs, starting with standard JSPs. Standard JSPs are used often, but again differ from standard specifications as some information changes from project to project. The liquidated damages specified JSP is a good example of where specific information has to be added. I refer to this as fill-in-the-blank information. Here are two examples of fill-in-the-blank information JSPs. Of course, not all standard JSPs need information added to them. Some have links that change, and others are simply JSPs that get used a lot. I wanted to point out the numbering system for the JSPs. In the one example, we have JSP 9011A. The 90 means it was created in 1990. The 11 means it was the 11th JSP created that calendar year. The letter A indicates that it has been revised once. The letter is updated with each revision. If the letter D had been used, that would indicate it was on its 4th revision. We do not use the letters I or O because they look too much like ones and zeros. Now we'll move on to the non-standard JSPs. Usually non-standard JSPs require divisional approval for use, are not used very often, are very specific and only used with specific projects, contain test methods that are subject to change, or have unique processes. This short example list shows the required approvals in the explanatory notes. There are some non-standard JSPs that could probably be moved to the standard JSP list. We haven't done that yet, but Engineering Policy Services will keep you posted as to when that happens. Moving on with the types of JSPs, we now have the Lpa Jsps. Local public agencies, or LPAs, also use MoDOT standards and specifications, as well as policies outlined in EPG 136. EPG 136.7 actually lists when certain JSPs are required in the LPA projects. Listed here are all 10 Lpa JSPs. JSP packages are really a bundle of JSPs that are used for certain types of projects. In this instance, we have 10 JSP bundles for job order contracts, or JOCs, seal coat projects, and contract level course, which we often call CLC projects. These bundles of JSPs are intended to save the district's time by being all-inclusive and ready to go, with the exception of some fill-in-the-blank information. The JSP packages are updated yearly, as shown by the highlights. This is done by the Engineering Policy Services section in the Central Office Design. There is still some fill-in-the-blank information required yet, but again, the intent is to save time by having these JSPs pre-packaged. I mentioned earlier there were 6 required JSPs for every project, except for job order contracts. The first one is general. Danica mentioned this a little bit earlier too. General, this is either a federal or a state general JSP, depending on the funding source. Or the general JSP can be a state non-prevailing wages JSP. This JSP is used when state funds are used for non-construction projects like mowing contracts. It doesn't get used very often. The second required JSP is contract liquidated damages. This JSP defines when the damages will be assessed for not completing a project on time. The third required JSP is the Work Zone Traffic Management JSP. This includes requirements such as having a contractor furnished work zone specialist, having a transportation management plan, and work hour restrictions. Fourth in the list is your emergency provisions and incident management. This is where local law enforcement and emergency contacts are added to the contract. Next is the project contact for the contractor bidding questions. When a contractor has questions regarding plans, quantities, or other JSPs, this JSP provides that contact information. The contact is usually the project manager. The last required JSP is the Supplemental Revisions JSP. This is a very diverse JSP. It can act as a holding place for provisions that might go away. It is a means for getting a revised standard specification into every contract before the next quarterly update. It is also a place for specifications that don't really have a place in our standard specifications, like the COVID-19 safety requirement and the anti-discrimination against Israel certification. This JSP changes often and should be checked regularly. There's actually one more required JSP. If there is a railroad within the project limits, you will need to contact the railroad section and multimodal division. They will provide a JSP for you to use in your contract. What happens if you need a JSP for your project, but it's not listed in the Jsp database? You will have to write your own JSP. On the slide, I have an example of a district-written JSP for dynamic curve warning system. The whole JSP wouldn't fit, so these are just a couple of snippets from that JSP. Randy will go over the parts of a JSP in more detail in just a few minutes. But typically, a district-written JSP includes the description, material used, the construction requirements, the method of measurement, and the basis of payment. District-written JSPs can be written by anyone, but usually it is someone from the design team that writes it. It is always a good practice to coordinate the JSPs with your other district divisions, such as traffic and maintenance. Regardless of who writes the JSP, the project manager is responsible for signing and sealing the JSP packet that goes into the contract. The bridge division has their own set of JSPs for bridge projects. The structural project manager typically signs and seals the bridge JSPs. There is another set of provisions to be considered when designing, constructing, and inspecting projects. This is the general provisions. General provisions, along with the supplemental revisions to the standard specification, make up the blue pack. It is called the blue pack because literally it used to have a blue cover on it back in the days when we did paper contracts. The general provisions are often forgotten because they're not part of the bidding documents, but they are important and they are contractually binding. Some of the general provisions include the 401 and 404 permits, DBE program, safety plan, and e-construction requirements. Now I'm going to hand the discussion over to Randy to share some additional JSP information.
Thank you, Sarah. The next thing we want to talk about is how the JSPs relate to the contract administration, what we use in construction materials, and how it's important with the administration of your contracts. And we begin with the hierarchy of documents. So job special provisions is number one. Then you go to project specific drawings, general provisions, supplemental specifications, standard specifications, standard drawings, and bid items or quantities. So the thing of note here on this is the job special provisions is number one on the list. A lot of people errantly think that bid items or quantities have a higher value. So what basically this list is which governs over what. So JSPs is at the top of the list. So if you have a conflict between any of these other drawings or contract documents, the JSP is going to rule. That's the reason it's very important to have it correct and accurate, because if there's a discrepancy, that's the one we're going to be going with from a contractual standpoint. Next slide, Sarah. And with that, wording is very important. So if the terminology in the contract administration and how you're administering it, little words may have big meanings when it comes to administration. Traditionally, when you see a condition is mandatory, the word shall will be used. If a condition is permissive or optional, the word may will be used. And when you see specifications, EPG, and other thing, when something's referring to what the contractor is required to do, it will say shall. When it's something the owner or MoDOT will say be required to do, the word will be used. And this should be consistent throughout specifications, JSPs, EPG, etc. Slide. So also that goes to clarity of the intent is extremely important. So what you want to do is not make the JSP too wordy or have overly detailed information. So what you're going to get with that is people are going to skim through that and miss the important stuff. If you have way too many words there, if I often equate this to, if you get an email and you have multiple paragraphs and just a lot of language and it's 3 pages long, likely you're just going to skim through it. That's much what a contractor is going to do with the JSPs, also with the inspection staff. So keep it very concise. Use the terms that are well understood with terms or meanings, because some words have dual definitions, so make sure that what you're saying can be understood by other parties other than yourself. With that, watch out for acronyms. Without a definition, you should always have if you're using an acronym, the first time you use it, you should have a definition with it, because different acronyms can be utilized for different things, and to create, make sure you don't create any confusion there. And I always say it's a good idea to have a second party review a document such as this if you're creating one, because much of when you may understand it perfectly because you know what you intended to do, but from someone else who's independent or maybe new to this, it may have a different meaning or may need some clarification. So an independent review is always advisable in this situation. As Sarah mentioned, there's 5 basic parts of a JSP. You got the description, what type of material, construction requirements, the method of measurement, and basis of payment. So you should have all of these elements in every JSP that you have. So I have an example here of a lightning protection system JSP, and we're going to walk through those individual parts that I just mentioned previously here. First, the description. On this particular one, the work shall consist of furnishing and installing complete lightning protection and grounding system as shown in the plans and is specified herein. All electrical materials and work shall, there's that important word again, be in accordance with the applicable requirements of section special, and it goes on there and details that out. So once again, make it clear and concise and get right to the point, but don't add any additional wording or verbiage that just to clutter it up and make it kind of water it down so it's not as easy to understand. Next, we're going to move on to what type of materials is used. In this specific instance, 2.1, air terminals. Air terminals shall be sized and shown on the drawings and shall be nickel dip polished copper. Mounting supports shall be provided as required. Once again, I highlight these words because you'll see shall and will a lot in documents. Also goes on to talk about down connectors and the listing for underwriter laboratories and for lightning protection, and UL listed and labeled. So it has all the requirements of the materials that you have on this particular JSP. Next becomes a very important one, the construction requirements. Down conductors shall be installed surface mounted in each tower, secured to the structure as shown on the drawings. It should be installed embedded in the concrete. So you need to know the type, size, and other specific requirements, such as testing requirements, certifications, etc. on these type of things on the construction requirements. Next, the method of measurement. So you got lightning protection, we measured as a unit lump sum quantity on this particular one. So what you're going to have examples as far as method of measurement, you could have cubic yards, lineal feet, stations, square yard, tons, etc. like that would be some of the typical ones that you will see in this particular section. Next, basis of payment. This is the ones important to the contractor. So in this particular one, lightning protection will be paid at the contract lump sum price, which shall be full compensation for furnishing and installing all materials, but including not limited to. This is also something where you'd want to spell out if something is incidental and not paid for directly, and not included somewhere else. That would be important to cover in this section as well. Next thing of important is the item numbers. So JSPs are used to specify types of materials rather than using notes on the plans. So they are not written for the sole purpose of establishing an item number. We've seen this be problematic in the past. So special 99 item numbers always require a JSP unless they're a modification of a standard or non-standard item number, where the modification can be clearly defined on the plans. It is best to give the 99 number a description of modified standard item description to notify the contractors it's not your typical standard bid item. There's something different there, so they don't breeze past that and miss something there. Also, use the standard bid pay item when possible to help materials inspectors reduce the amount of manual inputting of information for testing that is needed when using a 99 number, because if it doesn't have a standard pay item, then you're going to be having to figure out, what frequency of testing, what type of testing, things like that, which become, and to manually input that information is very time consuming. So anything you can help those folks out by using a standard pay item, it's always beneficial. Next is the testing requirements. So why is this important? Ensure the testing requirements are spelled out. And it's important so the contractor, the material supplier and the material inspector all have the same expectations. So the supplier needs to know what documentation, what testing they need to provide. The contractor needs to know what documentation to turn over to construction material staff, and the materials inspector needs to know what his expectations are and what QA testing and other requirements that they may have on their end. So this all aids in material tracking for the project. And why this is so extremely important is because it eliminates problems with the project closeout. Otherwise, if there's a lot of discrepancies here, there's discrepancy on who's responsible, kind of creates some bad blood between the entities. But also at the closeout at the end of the job, it's like, although you get a lot of miscellaneous stuff that you're still trying to track down. When we have testing, do we still need something? So it helps in the closeout, helps for the payment for the contractor, and it's just a good idea all the way around. So can construction material add a JSP to a contract? Yes. The best time is during collaboration to your core teams. If you know something that needs to be specifically spelled out, that's the best time to do it with plenty of advance notice. However, as a need arises, let's just say it's at the final field check or something like that, you can always work with the project manager to draft and insert a JSP if you see a need for one in this particular project. But if a JSP was errantly not included in the contract documents, it can be added by change order. Oftentimes, there's a lot of different documents that are put together. Something may be missing, be added as the contract is already underway, so it can be added requirements. There may be some additional pay component. Most of these are a no-cost change order. Non-routine JSP should be reviewed at the pre-con. So at your pre-construction meeting, to go through all of these is a good idea. We've all had the contractor at some point say, they're just JSPs. We don't read those. They're just JSPs. Well, that's a red flag there, because JSPs are extremely important on how we administer and draw attention to special things in the contract. So by reviewing these at the pre-construction meeting, we can manage those expectations before we get actually under construction and the heat of the battle. So at that point, it's a lot easier to resolve these issues up front before the contract begins and resolve those discrepancies or expectations, or maybe some modifications saying, we understand there's concern here. We can maybe make this change, and just manage those expectations and start out with a clean slate on your contract. And with that, we're going to move on to the final stage here. We hope you enjoyed the best ever JSP presentation that MoDOT has presented as far as we know. And we'd like to ask for questions at this time. And obviously, if you got questions after this, it'll be available. You can contact the engineering policy group. Any of us on the presenters here today, your liaisons in your particular divisions, or anyone else that may be able to help you with questions or concerns you may have with contract documents, JSPs, etc. And at this point of the program, we are going to move on to the question phase. So I know we covered a lot of material here, so we welcome and gladly welcome any questions that you may have at this point.
All right, thanks Randy, Sarah, and Danica. Great job on your presentation. I do not currently see any questions in the question and answer pod.
We just got one in the question.
Okay. All right, so does the JSP 90-11A need to be included by designing for each JSP, or will just the description work?
I'll try to answer that one. Typically, when you're creating your JSP packets, if it's a standard JSP, I believe, and Danica, correct me if I'm wrong, you put the standard JSP title and number, which would be like the 9011A, in your packet, and then the reviewers will add the rest of the language to the contract packet. Correct, Danica? Or is that changed now?
That has changed.
Okay, great.
Yep, you just go ahead and use it, put the standard in there. When you make any changes to a standard JSP, you need to remove the number from your JSP so that we know that you made changes to it. If you grab an old JSP, then the project reviewer will update it to the new JSP. As long as the number is still there, then we'll update it. But we try to make sure that you guys have the opportunity to make sure you make the changes that you need.
All right, another question. I'm not sure if I heard or understood correctly. Is the blue pack something that all contractors are aware of and something they look at?
Yes, the contractors do know that that it's included in the contract and they have to pay attention to that.
Jessica, are there any hands raised? So if you're not familiar with using WebEx, there is a raise your hand tool that's at the bottom of your screen. You can raise your hand, and if you want to ask a verbal question, you can just click that button and Jessica will unmute you so you can ask that question, or you can hit Control Shift R to raise your hand as well. All right, a couple more. All right, question in the pod. What happens if a JSP is not adhered to by the contractor?
It is a contractual document, so they have to adhere to it. It's not an optional thing. So it is, and as we noted earlier, it is the hierarchy as far as is the number one thing there. So the contract, it's not an optional thing. So I guess if for some reason the contractor did not want to adhere to it, then you could write an order record to make them comply. But yes, it's not an option. It is mandatory.
Okay, at some point, I was told that all 99 numbers needed a JSP, but if simple modification, can we just use a note on the plans?
Yes, you can just put a note on the plans, but you need to make sure that's very clear to the contractor, the expectations of that item, since it's a 99 number, it's not a standard number. So typically we really do want a JSP to cover it. And if it's standard and you just have like a little tweak to it, it doesn't have to be a very long JSP, but just covering the difference between that 99 number and the standard is best to do by a JSP.
All right, another question is, if you modify a standard or non-standard JSP from the website, should the JSP or non-standard JSP number be removed?
Yes, if you modify the JSP, then you should take the numbers off. If it's a fillable one, then you don't need to take the JSP numbers off unless you actually change the information in the standard or non-standard JSP.
Okay, what are some of the ways that design can talk to construction or materials and make sure the contract is being clearly written? Are there some common places where the ball is dropped, so to speak? What can we look out for?
I guess to begin with, we would start out with, the core team meetings and have that dialogue going. Like I said, the sooner you can get something in there that's concerned, sooner it's addressed in the process, because if you wait to the very last minute, certain things have to go out, addendums and stuff is messy and creates a lot of time lag for everyone. So I guess the general thing here is just get to that early in the process as opposed to later, and it's much better to get it incorporated in a more seamless process.
Yeah, I would add to that, Randy, is just hopefully construction has the opportunity to do a final review of the plans and JSPs at the end. So that's another opportunity to make sure that language is clear for when you administer that contract at the end. All right, another question is it better to refer back to the standard specifications and call out the relevant section, or copy the standard specification language into the JSP?
I would say it's better to reference the standard specification than to copy and paste it into your JSP. But just to make sure that you don't write something that you didn't want to. But you just need to make sure that you're using the most current JSP, or at the most current specification number when you refer to it in the JSP.
Okay, if a railroad is within the project limits, but no work is being done in its vicinity, is a railroad JSP still needed?
You should always go ahead and refer to Greg and Larry in the railroad section of MoDOT, and they will give you that JSP if it is needed, or they will say no, it's not needed. So if you have a railroad, just definitely reach out to them and verify that you do or you don't need it.
Yeah, because just to add to that, is we don't always know how far the right of way is for that railroad, or what other permits they have in that area. We need to have on that, in our railroad section in multimodal will be able to answer that question, and they have the contacts with those railroads. All right, another question. My
I just want to add
understanding,
to that, I just want to add to that, Kenny, that also there's may not be intuitively obvious what the railroad requirements are, because the railroads, even if they say like a crane can tip over and touch their traffic or be on their track or on their property, they would consider that something, even though we're not working on or directly over there still could be a need for that JSP as well.
yeah, and Tim Schrader made a good point that, it does take time. Sometimes there's additional language that needs to be written into that JSP for the railroad. So make sure you give them enough time to coordinate with the railroad so that they can draft that language in coordination with the railroad. We wish that could be a faster process, but it just takes some time. Another question is, please discuss the use of construction notes on the plans.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time, Kenny?
Yeah, please discuss the use of construction notes on the plans.
Yeah, I'm afraid I just need a little more information. I'm not sure what whoever asked the question, that give me a little more background information, what they're looking for specifically on that.
Yeah, but Bud, we can unmute you if you want.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, in my experience, it's always been advantageous for me to have construction notes on the plans to, kind of firsthand letting the contractor know, what my expectations are, in the design, rather than, kind of always rely upon him to look up a JSP or look up a standard spec. But there's something there that that I feel like he needs to be drawn attention to. I like to have him, have that on the plans, because they'll pay more attention to plans than, JSPs or even our standard specs. At least it'll be more firsthand. So thoughts on that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess that could be the case, but actually you kind of see the opposite as well. The contractor may oversee something on the plans. There's a lot of information out there, and the whole purpose of the JSP is to really hone in on specific things we want to pay attention to. So I think it's still a good idea to highlight those in a JSP, unless it's something somewhat generic or whatever. I still think it's a good idea to place that importance. And I said, contractors, some pay more attention to JSP or not, but they are, like I said, they're the hierarchy on the governing of documents, so that makes it important as well. So if there's a conflict between the plans and something else and standard plans, then which governs, and you get into those debates. So that would be my thoughts on that.
Well, all right, that's good discussion. Any other questions from anyone? All right, we'll go ahead and close from here. So if we didn't get to your questions on this topic today, please reach out to any of today's presenters. I hope today's presentation provided a better understanding of the purpose of job special provisions and how they should be developed and used on our projects. Thank you for participating in this webinar today. We appreciate any feedback on how we can improve this format or the content of future webinars. As we wrap it up this webinar, we will be registering your participation in Mo.u. The WebEx system allows us to track who is attending by computer, but we not know who may be attending as part of a group or by call-in. If you are in attendance but not signed in, please contact Jessica Gobin, and she will go ahead and give you credit for today's training.